Welcome to the channel, everyone. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you for listening. You ever hear about Nick Goodson's story? I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. It's not something they'd put on the local news, but down here in Bladenborough, we still talk about it, trading details like pieces of gruesome puzzle, trying to make sense of what happened in those woods. Nick was a park ranger, stationed at a nearby reserve, but often out exploring the broader wilderness on his own. Originally from Denver, he'd come down to North Carolina a few years back, looking for a change of scenery. His hobby was hiking, and he'd spent plenty of time trekking the Rockies before moving here. He loved being outdoors, away from the city noise, and always brought his dog Major along, a big mutt with a shaggy coat and a bark loud enough to echo off mountainsides. Bladenborough wasn't exactly like Denver. Sure, it had its share of natural beauty, lush forests, quiet trails, and wildlife aplenty, but the atmosphere was different. There was something older, almost oppressive, about the woods here. People whispered about strange sightings, and while most dismissed the tales as campfire fodder, Nick had heard enough stories to be wary. Still, he wasn't the superstitious type. It was late spring, the kind of season where the weather couldn't quite make up its mind. That day had started warm, the sun casting a golden glow through the canopy, but by the time Nick and Major had reached the deeper part of the woods, a chill wind had swept in. The trees swayed and creaked, their tops bending against the gusts, and the undergrowth rustled like something unseen was moving through it. Nick pulled his jacket tighter and pressed on, his boots crunching against the leaf-strewn trail. He planned to camp overnight, a quick escape from the daily grind. By early evening he set up his small tent and a fire, the flames crackling cheerfully against the encroaching dark. Major lounged nearby, his ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds. Nick sat by the fire, sipping from a thermos and watching the shadows dance. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the trees, but it didn't bother him much, not yet. The first sign of trouble came just after dusk. Major perked up, his ears stiff and his body tense. Nick followed the dog's gaze but saw nothing beyond the flickering firelight. Then came the noise, a faint rustling like dry leaves being disturbed. It stopped as quickly as it started. Nick dismissed it as a raccoon or a deer, but Major didn't relax. When the second noise came, it was closer, a loud guttural sound, almost like breathing, but too heavy and deliberate. Major growled, his hackles raised. Nick grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the trees. That's when he saw it, or at least the shape of it. Sitting behind a tree, just beyond the beam of his light, was something. He couldn't make out details, only a dark outline and two faint glints that could have been eyes. "Hello?" Nick called, though he regretted it immediately. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. The shape didn't move, it just stared. Nick stepped back toward the fire, his hand resting on the knife on his hip. Major barked, a sharp, angry sound that seemed to push the thing into motion. It slipped behind the tree, vanishing into the darkness. Nick's heart pounded, and he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was a bear, though it hadn't moved like one. Maybe. The attack came suddenly. Nick barely had time to react as the creature lunged from the shadows, a blur of teeth and claws. Major sprang to meet him, snarling and snapping. The firelight illuminated a flash of matted fur, too dark and coarse to belong to anything familiar. Nick grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it, the flames hissing as the creature dodged back. It was fast, unnaturally so. Major yelped as the thing swiped at him, leaving a bloody gash along his side. Nick shouted, throwing the log, and the creature retreated into the trees. But the reprieve was brief, they couldn't stay there. Packing up was out of the question. Nick grabbed his knife and his flashlight, slinging Major's leash over his arm. The dog limped but stayed close, his loyalty unwavering. They moved through the woods as quietly as they could, Nick's heart racing with every step. The wind howled, masking the sound of pursuit, but he knew the creature was out there. He could feel it. Bladenborough had its share of legends, stories of the beast of Bladenborough, a bloodthirsty predator that had terrorized the area decades ago. Nick had always thought it was just an old wives' tale, a way to scare kids into staying out of the woods, but now he wasn't so sure. Hours passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Nick kept moving, his muscles burning and his mind racing. At one point he thought he saw the creature again, its eyes glinting through the trees, but when he turned his light on it, there was nothing there. They finally stumbled onto a dirt road just as the first hints of dawn colored the sky. Nick collapsed to his knees, Major pressing close to him. The forest behind them was silent, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. Nick never went back to those woods. He told his story to a few people, mostly other rangers, but the details always sounded too unbelievable. Still, anyone who's heard it knows better than to dismiss it outright. In Bladenborough, the woods hold their secrets tightly, and sometimes those secrets bite back. You ever heard of the night Keanu Oldman and his friends stopped at the gas station down in the bayou? If you haven't, I wouldn't blame you. Folks around here don't talk about it much, like saying it all out might summon the thing back. Keanu was from Boulder, Colorado, a sturdy guy, gym-trained and built like someone who could handle himself. Working as a zookeeper back home, he had a knack for understanding animals, their behavior, their instincts. He had a calm way about him, but not the type to ignore warning signs. His family was tight-knit, the kind of folks who taught him early on to respect nature. His sister Amy always sent him articles about cryptids and bizarre encounters, joking about how one day he might see something he couldn't explain. He used to laugh about it, not anymore. That winter, Keanu and three friends, Lauren, Eddie and Maya, were road tripping around Louisiana, chasing some vague notion of adventure. The air was crisp, unusually cold for the region, and the wind whistled through the cypress trees like something alive. They'd been driving for hours on back roads when the gas gauge dipped low. Lucky for them, they spotted a weathered gas station tucked just off the road, its neon sign flickering weakly in the misty air. The place was a relic, peeling paint, a single pump, and a shack that looked like it had grown out of the swamp. As they pulled up, Keanu noticed the forest pressing close around them, the dark trees almost swallowing the station whole. Eddie hopped out to pump gas while Lauren and Maya stretched their legs. Keanu wandered toward the shack, curious but uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Inside, the air was thick with scent of old wood and mildew. An old man sat behind the counter, his face as weathered as the station itself. He barely looked up as Keanu approached. "Strange night to be out this way," the man muttered, his voice gravely. Keanu nodded, trying to be polite. "We're just passing through." The old man's gaze sharpened. "Best keep it that way." Keanu didn't push for more. He paid for the gas and stepped back outside, the wind biting through his jacket. As he walked back to the car, Major, the forest dog, started barking again. Keanu turned toward the tree line and saw it. Just a shape at first. It was crouched low, partially hidden behind a tree, staring. The eyes glinted like embers in the darkness, unblinking. "Eddie," Keanu called, his voice tight. "Get in the car." Eddie looked up, confused, but one glance at Keanu's face was enough to get him moving. Lauren and Maya climbed back into the car, their chatter dying as they noticed the tension. But when they looked toward the tree line, the shape was gone. Keanu didn't sleep that night. They'd found a small motel not far from the gas station, a rundown place that smelled of damp carpet and mothballs. He kept thinking about the thing behind the tree, the way it had stared at him, like it was sizing him up. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but this was different. The next day, they decided to explore the area a bit against Keanu's better judgment. The bayou stretched out like an endless labyrinth, with narrowed trees and stagnant water creating an eerie, dreamlike landscape. They built a fire near a clearing and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. It was late afternoon when they heard the first scream. Maya had wandered a bit too far, and by the time they found her, she was gone. Just gone. There were no sound, no struggle, just her coat snagged on a low branch. The fire crackled behind them as they searched frantically, calling her name until their voices went hoarse. That's when they saw it again, sitting just at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind another tree, was the creature. This time, it didn't just stare, it moved. It was fast, faster than anything Keanu had ever seen. The shadows seemed to ripple as it lunged, grabbing Lauren before any of them could react. Her scream cut through the cold air, but the creature disappeared into the forest with her before they could do anything. Panic set in. Eddie grabbed a branch from the fire, brandishing it like a weapon. Keanu pulled up his knife, his instinct screaming at him to run, but he couldn't leave, not yet. They searched for hours, following faint trails of blood and broken branches. But the deeper they went, the darker it became. The wind howled through the trees, carrying sounds that didn't belong, low growls, snapping twigs, and faint whispers that made their skin crawl. By the time they found Lauren, it was too late. She was slumped against a tree, her throat torn open. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but the air was thick with its presence. Keanu and Eddie didn't waste any more time. They ran, crashing through the underbrush, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. They didn't stop until they reached the main road. A pickup truck eventually stopped for them, the driver, a local man, taking one look at their faces and letting them in without a word. Keanu tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow. The man just nodded, his expression grim. "Rougarou," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "You're lucky to be alive." Keanu never went back to Louisiana. He left the bayou behind, but the memory stayed. Sometimes, late at night, he'd catch himself staring into the shadows, half expecting to see these glowing eyes staring back. They say David Johnson doesn't talk about what happened that winter in Arizona. Not to anyone, and maybe it's better that way, but I heard about it from someone who was on that same trip, one of the few who made it back. The story sticks with you like a cold shadow. David was a mechanic from Lawrence, Kansas, a no-nonsense kind of guy who spent his weekends fishing with his mud diesel. Fishing was more than a hobby for him. It was a quiet escape, a way to clear his head after long days under the hood of someone else's car. Kansas winters were cold, but nothing compared to the sharp, unrelenting chill of the high desert in Arizona, where the trip took place. The travel agency had promised a unique experience: winter fishing at a secluded lake surrounded by rugged desert terrain. There were 6 people in total, plus the guide, a grizzled old man named Clyde, who looked like he'd been carved straight out of the mountains themselves. The group set out early in the morning, the sky overcast and heavy with snow clouds. David brought Diesel along, figuring the dog could enjoy the wide open spaces. The lake was nestled deep within a wooded canyon, the landscape stark but beautiful, dusted with snow that glittered under the faint winter sun. The first day went well enough. They caught a few fish, shared stories around a roaring fire, and marveled at the serene beauty of the lake. David liked the group. They were a mix of city folks and outdoorsy types, each bringing their own quirks to the campfire conversation. But as night fell, the air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the camp. Even Diesel, usually bold and curious, stuck close to David, his ears pinned back and his tail low. It was Clyde who first mentioned the stories. "This land's old," he said, his voice low. "Older than you can imagine. People been seeing strange things out here for generations. Shadows in the woods, howls in the night, stuff that don't belong." The group chuckled nervously, brushing it off as campfire talk. But David noticed the way Clyde's eyes lingered on the dark tree line, his expression far too serious for a man just spinning a yarn. Sometime after midnight, Diesel started growling. David sat up in his tent, his breath visible in the frigid air. The growl turned into a low warning rumble, and Diesel's hackles rose. David unzipped the tent and stepped out, scanning the camp with a flashlight. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows over the snow-covered ground. That's when he saw it, something crouched behind the tree at the edge of the camp, barely visible in the dim light. At first it looked like a man, but the proportions were all wrong, too tall, too lean, with a head that seemed to sit too far forward. Its eyes glinted like amber in the beam of the flashlight, unblinking and filled with a predatory intelligence. It didn't move, just stared. Diesel barked wildly, and the thing slinked back into the shadows, disappearing without a sound. David woke the others, his voice tight with urgency. They searched the perimeter, but found nothing, not even tracks in the snow. Clyde muttered something about dogmen, old legends he'd heard as a boy, stories of half-men, half-beasts creatures that prowled the woods, hunting those who ventured too far into their territory. No one slept that night. They kept the fire blazing and took turns standing watch, their breath hanging in the cold air as the snow began to fall. The woods felt alive, the trees whispering with the wind, and every rustle or snap of a branch set their nerves on edge. By dawn, the group decided to leave, but as they packed up camp, the thing returned. This time, it didn't stay hidden. It moved through the trees, circling them, its movements fluid and unnervingly fast. When it lunged, it went for Clyde first. The old man screamed as the creature dragged him into the woods, his cries echoing before abruptly cutting off. Blood stained the snow where he stood. Panic set in. David grabbed Diesel and led the others toward the trail they'd come in on. But the creature wasn't done. It stalked them, darting between the trees, always just out of reach, but close enough to keep their fear sharp. They could hear its low growls, the crunch of snow beneath its feet. One by one, the group fell behind, either from exhaustion or terror. David tried to keep them together, shouting for them to move faster, to stay quiet, but when the creature attacked again, it was chaos. Blood sprayed across the snow, screams filled the air, and Diesel barked furiously, his teeth bared as he could scare the thing off. By the time David and Diesel reached the main road, only two others were still with them, bloodied, pale, and barely able to speak. A passing truck stopped for them, the driver's face dark with concern as he helped them into the cab. They didn't look back as the truck sped away, leaving the woods and whatever horror lurked within them behind. David never went on another fishing trip, and Diesel, once bold and adventurous, refused to leave the house after dark. As for the others who survived, they didn't stay in touch. Some things, it seems, are better left buried in the snow and silence of that cursed lake. They say it's easy to get lost in the Appalachian woods, easy to lose more than just your way. I heard this story from a guy who swore it happened to his cousin's friend. The kind of story you hear in truck stops, passed along by people like Chuck Russell, who knew these mountains better than most. Chuck was a trucker from Chicago, someone who loved his routines. The gym in the morning, long-haul drives in the day. That winter, he decided to mix things up. A travel agency was offering an adventurous Appalachian experience, and Chuck figured, why not? It was supposed to be a guided tour of the region's natural beauty, complete with cozy stops at mountain lodges. There were 6 of them in total, plus a guide named Erin, who drove the agency van, a reliable old beast that chugged along through the winding roads. The first few hours went fine. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a slate gray sky, and mountains loomed like silent giants around them. Chuck had brought his hiking boots and a decent pack, expecting some rough trails. What he didn't expect was for the van to sputter and die on a remote stretch of road, deep in the forest, miles from nearest town. Erin tried her best to get the engine running, but no luck. They were stuck. With no cell service and no idea how far it was to help, the group decided to wait by the van while Erin and another guy, Ted, walked back down the road to find assistance. That left Chuck and the others, 3 tourists from out of state and a young couple from the city. They built a fire to keep warm, using dead branches from the forest floor. Chuck, ever practical, pulled out the survival knife he always carried and helped get it going. The wind picked up as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the snow. Chuck sat by the fire, feeling the eerie quiet of the woods settle in around them. He'd been in desolate places before, but there was something about this spot that set his teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees, or how the shadows seemed to move just a little too much when you weren't looking. When Erin and Ted didn't return by nightfall, the group grew uneasy. Chuck volunteered to keep the fire going while the others huddled in the van, trying to stay warm. As the hours dragged on, Chuck found himself thinking about the game he'd played as a teenager, a survival horror game set in the wilderness. One of the enemies was a massive shadowy figure, always just out of sight, but impossible to escape once it found you. That's when he noticed it, movement in the trees. At first he thought it was a trick of the firelight, but then Diesel, the young couple's energetic dog, started growling, his hackles rising as he stared into the darkness. Chuck followed the dog's gaze, squinting into the shadows. There was something there, something tall and still, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Who's there?" Chuck called, his voice firm. No answer, just the wind and the faint creak of branches. The figure didn't move, but Chuck could feel its eyes on him, unblinking and cold. He tightened his grip on the knife, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. When he turned back toward the van to call the others, the thing was gone. He didn't mention it to the group, not yet. They were already on edge and he didn't want to spook them further. But he kept his knife close and his eyes on the tree line. It wasn't until the second night that they realized Erin and Ted weren't coming back. The young couple wanted to stay put, convinced that help would arrive eventually. Chuck disagreed. He'd seen the stories. Those mountains were old, full of things that didn't belong in the modern world. Things like the creature he thought he saw. Things like the stories people whispered about, tales of massive, human-like figures stalking the forests, dragging people off into the night. By the time they decided to leave, it was already too late. The creature came back, this time closer. It moved with terrifying speed, darting between trees like a shadow brought to life. Chuck saw it clearly then, a massive figure, covered in dark matted fur, with glowing amber eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. It didn't attack outright, not yet. It stalked them, herding them like prey as they scrambled to gather their things. When it finally struck, it was chaos. The creature tore through the group with brutal efficiency, its strength unmatched. Chuck fought back, his knife useless against the thing's thick hide. Blood sprayed across the snow, screams echoed through the forest, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of fear. Somehow, Chuck and 2 others managed to make it back to the van. The creature didn't follow them inside, but it circled the vehicle, its heavy footfalls crunching through the snow. They sat there, weapons drawn and breathing hard, until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, the creature was gone, but the blood and bodies left behind were a grim reminder that the mountains didn't let everyone go. Chuck never signed up for another group trip, and the others, well, they don't talk about it much either. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good night.